Hey everyone, Jacob here, and in this video I wanted to share with you how I use the Catalyst Canvas, a free Figma template, to design A/B tests. And in this first open test, I picked Airbnb's property page, and I'm going to share with you a couple variants and basically how I structure an experiment. And as a source of inspiration, this idea is coming from this kind of most recent leak, where we detected that Airbnb actually tested something that didn't work out. And it's basically this introduction of auto-suggested dates. So if someone hasn't picked a check-in or checkout date, they showed this date range that was suggested. And they rejected this. So this might have been insignificant, might have had a negative effect. We don't know because it's just a public kind of leak. But just because this happened, I thought like this still has some potential, and so I'm taking this kind of experiment as a source of inspiration and then iterating on that. Okay, so again, this is using the Catalyst Canvas for Figma, which I'll link up to in the description, and I'll go over by some of the kind of the things I tagged here for this experiment. So obviously a title, and I'm thinking like the primary metric that someone like Airbnb might want to improve are probably reservations. So these transactions for reserving a property. Here I also added guardrails, which are basically like metrics that you don't want to hurt. So I'm assuming revenue might be a good one here. There might be others, but revenue, because anytime we're messing with check-in, checkout dates, number of guests, that probably impacts revenue at the end of the day there. So so that might be a good metric to also measure and watch for. Scope, where this kind of experiment might be started, might be triggered, might be running. Property pages, audience everyone, devices desktop only. Maybe it could be done on mobile as well, but to save some time, I just worked on desktop here. And a type of experiments at ABCD. Here, let's just add that there. Do we have evidence? Yes, and I'll show what that actually means. And a prediction. Prediction basically comes from again past test data, which I'll show examples of. But this is our best variation here that might be doing 6% more to engagement. Okay, so a shallow kind of metric on just people clicking and starting the flow. Okay, so here we have actually, before I get started, let me clarify that I'm not affiliated with Airbnb. I just picked this because I thought this is kind of a nice example to work with. Okay, so here we have the control. This is the kind of what someone might have currently as their version of their site or screen that they want to improve. And here we have, in this example, 3 variants, so B, C, and D. And here the proposed change is to expose the calendar. So, and that's coming from a particular pattern which has positive probability, pattern 14, that has been tested 12 times with these kind of results that GoodUI members can see. And basically what we're doing is that every time this was tested, whether it won or not, whether it was significant or not, it had all sorts of effects in different conditions, we're trying to net or summarize or compact some of these kind of effects to help us estimate what future experiments might bring. So here I just pulled the engagement metric as basically a median from 6 experiments, which is hinting that instead of hiding stuff inside pull-down menus, but actually showing those options is a good thing. So that's how we know, based on that evidence-based pattern, that it might be worthwhile to experiment with, run an A/B test where we show an exposed calendar. Okay, so that's where we typically call out these changes, just to be conscious of what's going on, what are the variables that have been adjusted. And that's this. Here we have an interaction, kind of a description, what might happen if someone actually clicks this. I'm just imagining that maybe this would like fly out, and the second month would appear here as well. Okay. Notice the situation here. So typically what I see is when people design A/B tests, like they might suggest one change and they're thinking that, okay, they only changed that one thing. But in reality, what happens is like there's additional variables that sometimes by bringing in this change, notice how this was pushed down. Okay, so that button, instead of being like somewhere here, went further down. And more so, we can call this out that this has negative evidence. This is basically an inverse. So we know that typically calls to action and buttons, the higher they are, especially if they're above the fold, they typically tend to bring in positive effects. Positive effects on engagement, on conversions, on sales. And so if we're doing the opposite, we know that this is potentially a negative. So just calling that out there. Okay. Version C is a reaction to this negative evidence here. So what we're trying to do here is keep basically the exposed calendar and maybe try a version where the button is above the form, the calendar and such. This has positive evidence. To me, this kind of feels a little weird. Just because, I mean, typically forms, usually when we're asking someone to do something, we'd expect the button to be lower. And maybe that's fine. Maybe we'll discover that this particular situation will not work, might hurt, might create errors and such. But as of today, we actually don't have an experiment like that. We don't have an experiment which shows that that's the case. And if that were to be tested and bring in a negative effect, we'd add that to our pattern collection. And for the future, we might know that under these circumstances, maybe this is a terrible idea. But until we don't have that, here's the kind of variant to try and inverse this kind of this change here. And finally, D is also based on this variation here, on variation B. And in version D, all we're doing is fast forwarding to that kind of month which has availability, which has available dates. So this is kind of copied from a screenshot from an actual property, and suggesting that, hey, maybe we should bring these forward so that people don't have to kind of scroll, so they're a little bit less friction, and this label changed as well. Okay, so with this kind of experiment, what we're doing is we're trying to separate these variables into separate variations. So here we're doing the exposure, and here we're doing the exposure and the auto suggest. And then ultimately, when we have the results, we could potentially compare D to B to check whether the auto-suggest works or not. Okay? And then, of course, we can also compare C to B to check whether this higher button works or not. Okay? And that's our test structure. That's what I would typically might go into a review, and if everyone has any other ideas or something like that, like we might generate other variants and decide whether to test them in this test or in a future test. But yeah, that's typically how Canvas can be used to explore ideas, minimize the effort. So notice that these are like placeholders, so I don't have to like redesign everything else there. And then it creates focus for the area that is changing. And then the other important thing is calling out these changes so that people become more conscious of what exactly is being adjusted for better or for worse. And then, of course, calling out some of the kind of predictions using past test data. Some might have positive, some might have negative. Some changes might not have any data, and that's fine as well. We're always learning, new things here, and just because we don't have something hasn't been tested, can still be explored, and I think that's a really great thing there. So yeah, that's hopefully this is helpful. Leave your comments behind if you have questions, and again, I'll link up to some of these kind of resources, and hopefully it was useful. Thanks.